I'll try to go as quickly as I can and still be understood. My lovely wife this morning, the only thing she said to me was, "Don't talk like a leprechaun." So loads of faith she has in me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of open source in EU-based projects versus pure open source projects derived from the community based on experiences from my own kind of past history. So me, unfortunately, I have to admit, I know absolutely nothing about software, full stop. I don't know how any of it works. I am a hardware engineer at the start. A very good friend of mine who's a developer in Stripe tells me the only bits and bytes I understand are the drill bits and bytes of my lunch. So I don't understand anything, but this is hardware. So my side of open source was introduced and run in the hardware space. So from the community side, I've been heavily involved in the kind of open hardware and research mobilization field over a many number of years, starting originally in open source prosthetics. So manufacturing, distributing and production of open source prosthetics, mainly the Enable Hand project, probably 10 plus years ago, and we've been manufacturing them via a non-profit since kind of the project kicked off. And then things like responses to COVID, and I ran a big Ireland-based open source response project that some of you might be aware of. I know Gar is, he knows, he kept us safe in an awful lot of ways. And so all of that work was translating grassroots innovation into some form of real-world use in practice. Secondly, the other side of that coin is I spend most of my time now working on EU-funded projects as a research and exploitation kind of lead in these projects. So the big multinational, multi-European, multi-million euro funded projects from a European side, I am the actor that looks after exploitation, commercialization, and more and more recently, to the benefit of the world in my mind, more and more open source adoption, open source data sets, open source release of information. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the dynamics between the two based on some examples. And again, I needed to get AI in there somewhere. I couldn't talk about it, so I have some lovely AI images that I integrated. But from my perspective, I interact between two dominant models of open source. The EU-funded open source, and anyone that's worked on a European-funded project or worked with a large organization like Europe knows, you know, highly structured, highly time-bound, highly regulated, governed and driven by deliverables and, you know, high-level governance. And then it has to be policy-aligned, mission-driven, highly regulated. Now, I'm not saying that's the best thing in the world. Lots of things get left on the table for want of a lack of bureaucracy, but that's one side. The other side then is open source community driven stuff. So organic, super long lived ecosystems. Kubernetes was mentioned, it will go on forever. You know, huge, long running communities that will last an awful long time, an awful lot more meritocratic, you know, participation. Again, anyone that's worked in large EU funded projects, I wouldn't call them meritocratic. Depends on your role and your title, if you're a professor or if you're not, if you're a student. So the community-driven ones are much more meritocratic. And then it's kind of an awful lot of adoption-led evolution. They adapt, they change, they flow, they can evolve much easier than these large standard things. So in my mind, like, and I've spent an awful lot of time recently looking at innovation happens when these two meet. And I also say, or if these meet, because unfortunately there's an awful lot of times a big wall between the two. Both sides don't want to play with each other, but we have to into the future. So critical differences between them, and these are the factors that I've noticed cause the issues or problems. One is time horizon. These funded research-based projects are time-bounded, 3 to 4 years in general, and as the projects start to end, people start to move on, legacies get left behind, you know, assets get lost, whereas community runs will run for decades, ultimately can run forever, and they hold over and pass the baton of ownership. Similarly then, ownership. EU projects have consortium responsibility. For the good or bad, it is owned temporarily, but then it's also owned by everybody. So what happens when the project ends? How do you split ownership? How do you share development? How do you share costs? And whereas communities have a much more collective stewardship approach. And then finally, success metrics are different. EU projects, if you're funded, the success is based on deliverables. Have you submitted your deliverables? Are they accepted? You know, do you have to do rewrites? Yes, great, success, move on. Whereas communities are an awful lot more adoption driven. So, you know, we have to kind of, the gaps between the two worlds, I think, explains why an awful lot of outputs stall or can't make that jump from one side to the other in practice. So a couple of examples. During COVID, I started and ran an open source intervention called TeamOSV. I recommend you never, ever do anything like this in the future. Like all of this grey in my beard has come directly from this. So we span up relatively quickly during COVID. I think our final numbers in the end were like 3,800 contributors online. We ran for 18 months and we had spread across 144 countries. It was focused initially at developing those emergency resource and open development ventilator concepts, but then quickly opened up into PPE and, you know, education accessories, digital tools, things like that. Our strangest thing was delivery of flowers from somebody that grew commercial flowers to a nursing home, you know, so anything that was open and available was integrated here. What worked in the project, the governance, the translation and the ownership emerged alongside the creation. So it was always fit for the needs of application and fit for purpose. We had direct or hospital deployments. It was idea, production, hospital. Those lines and barriers were gone. And then we had super rapid iteration with clinicians. We had immediate feedback. It worked. We tried it 10 minutes ago. Here's what worked. Here's what didn't. Give us the next version. What didn't work was it was absolute chaos. Now, the world was in chaos at that time, but it was very volunteer dependent. And again, the quality of the volunteers is very, very hard to, you know, measure. You're a world leading respiratory surgeon versus somebody that has just built something in their shed. You have to give them equal time. Your allocation didn't really work. Sustainability after the project was really unresolved. Who owned it? Where did it live? So in the end, we open sourced everything and left it online for other people to develop. And then there was an awful lot of guidance misdirection. A great example here, I think, is one of the best examples of national level guidance leading people in the wrong way. The British government released a thing called a minimal functional ventilator standard, if anyone remembers that. They created, released it and said, if we're going to use any of these, this is what they have to look like. They never told anybody, they never consulted the NHS or any medical professionals. So the spec was completely wrong. The spec was made 5 times more complex, and then a lot of the projects died because they started off in the wrong direction. So translation happened during development and not after. So from that sort of thing, something that we've been using recently in the company that I work for, ICP, which is the commercial development company that exploits these EU-based projects, is this thing, Open Research Stack. I accelerated the release of this, let's say, so there is an Open Zenodo that I made last night for anyone that wants to have access to it. It was a bit premature, let's say, so the white paper that goes with it is not my best work, so don't judge me harshly on it. But I wanted to get it out there and it's openly available. What it is it identifies the elements of projects that we need in order to commercialize and exploit properly. So all projects have funding and community because the money has to come from somewhere and the people have to do the work. The foundations are always there, software, hardware, data, frameworks, metrics, they have them. Governance, sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. Ownership, licensing, IP, decision rights, things like that. Sustainability, large government-funded projects, not necessarily always included. Maintenance, funding, continuity, business models. And then translation at the top, rarely included in the mix. So industry adoption, startups, procurement, policy, if that happens, it happens way too late. So the majority of these large projects have these things down here, but you really need these things at the top in order to actually adopt and get impact and, you know, disperse beyond the end of the project. So we used that model in a project that I worked on with ICP. It was called 5G Timber. It's recently closed. We had our final review meeting for it on Wednesday, so it's still fresh. And we got a huge amount of outcomes, 25 innovations, 4 business use cases. We filed 7 patents, both EPO and national level ones. The guidance was great. We had control and definition of ambition plans and structure from the beginning. We had great IP strategy. We had a great ecosystem that we built and curated. Sustainability was considered. We considered market needs. We had clear commercial pathways. Ownership was clear. We had significant open source baseline plans. It was open source first before it went to anything else. And then translation worked by making sure we built a little ecosystem in which people could see the information and get access to a range of standardization contributions, white papers, best practices, and publications. So it has worked in practice, and I share it with you all that if it works, great, tell me. If it doesn't, tell me what doesn't work, and we'll do version 2. So hybrid innovation model is the way that kind of we're working towards, and I see as a real benefit for the future. Public funding is going to be included in it. It accelerates the creation at the beginning and the end. We need to use that funding to tap in and maybe supply to open communities to make sure we have continuity. And then we need industry involved to scale in practice. So this is what we want to do. And what does this mean for Ireland or elsewhere? I'm quite proud of my little AI Strong Ireland or elsewhere. So It is a massive advantage. Universities, we need to integrate and design for project ownership from day one. From the beginning, who's going to own this when we don't really care anymore? That is a massive drop-off factor. Startups and SMEs, they need to get engaged earlier in these research projects, not in year 3 of a 4-year project, not in the last 6 months from day one. And then corporates and public sector, treat open source as strategic infrastructure. It's not a threat. It's not a collaboration. It's in there together. So that is me. Please do come and talk to me today. Connect with me on LinkedIn via the QR code. If there's anything I can do to help, please do let me know. And I'm looking forward to talking with you all then today.